We often pinpoint the 1970s as the starting point of U.S.-China trade. The origin actually reached back to the 1600s when the American colonies were part of England. It was from the mid 1600s up until the eve of the Revolution that the Americans had grown accustomed to a great array of Chinese goods, courtesy of the British East India Company, which had a monopoly over Far Eastern commerce. The way in which Americans got tea, silk, and porcelain in which early years was primarily through the British East India Company. There was also a lot of smuggling going on at the time. The Dutch were famous for bringing tea to the colonies from Dutch East Indias. And the Americans would also travel to Dutch East Indias and circumvent the British East India Company monopoly. Either way, it wasn't the Americans going to China to get these goods. By the time of the American Revolution, Americans knew not so much about China, but they knew a lot about a few Chinese goods, and they greatly desired them. Foremost among these goods was tea. On the eve of the Revolution, the Americans were consuming more than 1 billion cups of tea annually. The use of china or porcelain, another Chinese invention, was widespread in the colonies. Although originally in the late 1600s, early 1700s, it tended to be wealthier Americans who could purchase these exotic Chinese goods. But, Chinese good. By the mid 1700s, the demand had ramped up, the supply that ramped up, the price had gone down far enough so even the average American colonists were drinking tea and would have china plates and bowls in their cabinets. What were American view of the Chinese before they started trading and after? Before the trade, Americans had to rely on secondhand information. Marco Polo and others who have traveled from west to east wrote about their experiences. A lot of the greatest inventions in the world at the time can be traced back to China. Gunpowder, the compass, the wheelbarrow, suspension bridges. The Chinese were an extremely advanced civilization, the most advanced in the world for thousands of years. When Westerns got their first gaze upon China, they were very impressed. Americans' entry into China trade during the late 1700s and early 1800s was just at the time when the Chinese emperor was starting to crumble. China was being beset by a whole range of internal and external problems: famine, interior revolution, problems with the military, and the rise in opium smoking. At the time that American was starting to really come to grips with China, China was on a downward spiral. Also, the Americans that went over there by and large during the period I talk about where merchants, and up until the end of the Napoleonic Wars, most merchants only saw silver of China. They were in Canton. They were in a rough, wall-off part of the city, and they were exposed to some of the meanest elements of Chinese society. They felt they were being cheated, They didn't like what Chinese ate. They made fun of how they walked, how they looked, how they dressed. There were any numbers of things that American merchants found less than commendable about the Chinese. Thank you for listening to the China Trade with America.